Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Flatirons Tuning. Here in the shop again with Jeremy from Money Shift Rally. We're going to try something a little bit different, which is we're going to dive into some data logs, but we're going to put the data logs up on screen. So if all goes according to plan and you're watching this, you're going to see a whole bunch of graphs on the screen here in a second. And this is because, so Jeremy, in your rally car, Money Shift Rally, you are running an Emtron.
Mm-hmm.
So you're able to do a lot of data recording.
Yeah. That's a standalone ECU, by the way. It's
Yep.
not as popular as the Haltex you see, but it's a very capable standalone.
For sure, it's kind of in the ballpark of a Motec.
Yeah.
So you guys were out at 100 Acre Wood,
Mm-hmm.
had a good rally, but in the process of this rally, you recorded a lot of data.
Yeah.
With the standalone, and so now we are going to be able to go back through this data, and there's a lot of interesting things that you found when you were kind of going through the charts of everything you recorded. And I think it would be really interesting to go through that with you, and then you guys at home, you can be a fly on the wall and see all of this. And let's just talk through.
Sure. Yeah.
What you found. I mean, first, just broad strokes. How did the rally go? Like any.
The rally went really well for us, considering, and I think we talked about this before, how many things we changed on the car right before we went to go race it. It's best laid plans of mice and men. There was some that we wanted, so we bumped up the power level of the engine. We got a new long block built by Skyline Engines, bumped the compression ratio, went to a more efficient turbo. We went to a Garrett 2860, which is really popular in stage rally.
Different restrictor.
The ARA changed their restrictor rules, so we had to go to 33 millimeter restrictor from the 34 we were using. And we actually took that opportunity to redesign the restrictor to try to get as much oomph out of it as possible. The restrictor just limits airflow, and air roughly equates to power. We found that with the new design, even though the restrictor diameter decreased by a mil, which is it's like, if you look at the actual area of it, it's something like an 8% decrease, I believe, in the actual amount of air you're letting through. Yeah. We met with the new design, we still flowed about 15% more air through the smaller restrictor. Yeah. So we gave the engine a lot more opportunity to make power, especially at the top end. And so in terms of getting out there and everything running pretty well, and doing, being fast and doing what we wanted to do, we were pretty successful at it. Yeah. We did have a serious off at one point, but we were able to recover and keep racing. On this off, let's just give clip notes, and maybe I'll put up a picture, but what was the damage? What happened? So what happened is we ended up a little farther outside one of the corners than we wanted to. It was all marbly, so the car went straight off, and it was one of those things where you're going off, and it's like, Pettiford has his rules about if you're gonna crash, how, etc. What your priorities are. Yeah. So we managed to go straight into a tree.
Oh, good.
We managed. Cameron managed to aim for the smaller tree as opposed to the bigger tree, which is usually better. And I managed to aim so it hit the corner of the nose of the car instead of dead on. Good. The car, one of the changes we made was a front mount intercooler, and it would have been pretty hurtful to us if we had put this shiny new front mount on it and then immediately center punch the car into a tree. Yeah. So we only we took off the corner of the car, demolished like the fender, and tore off the bumper. So we went from a fairly typical looking WRX, a 2012 with the bumper and everything, to just no bumper, no fender guards, none of that, just everything hanging out all in the open.
Yep. And what's interesting is the data before and after that is pretty interesting. That's one of the things we're going to get into.
Yeah. So full disclosure, in testing the car, we got it on the dyno probably about a week before we were going to leave for the rally.
Okay. Yeah.
No, actually, sorry. We left for the rally on Wednesday. We were on the dyno on Sunday.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So then we spent Monday through Tuesday testing. On the dyno, we didn't see any issues. The engine ran really strong, really great. Temperatures were fine. It was interesting. This is the first time I had so we spent all day on the dyno up at the Booze Creep.
Yeah.
Harvey's a great tuner, and he was, he was really interested in getting the car dialed in. So we spent a lot of time steady state tuning, which meant that we actually got the engine pretty hot.
Yeah.
But it seemed to cool down just fine once you started to like let off and let it recover. So we thought we were okay. But then as soon as we started testing at our little test track, our dirt track, we immediately knew we had a cooling problem.
Okay.
Specifically with the oil cooler.
Okay.
So the car has an external oil cooler. It's the Roger Clark Motorsport kit that uses a thermostatic oil plate and a cooler. We had mounted it right behind the grill in the nose of the bumper.
Okay.
But we made one of those critical mistakes that a lot of people run into when they start adding coolers and stuff like that, is we did not do enough ducting around it.
Okay.
So that when you had a lot of head on air, like, talking about highway stuff, just being at highway speeds, head on air coming into the bumper, the cooler was working pretty well. But as soon as we started getting into corners, sideways, high RPMs, without a lot of direct airflow, the oil temperatures really started going up.
And this is where some of the data after the crash is really interesting.
Yeah.
So we will dive into that. Let's see. Maybe oil temperature and oil pressure is as good a place to start as any, unless there's any other data points that you want to kind of talk about first before we dive into oil and coolant temperature.
So let me talk about what we monitor.
Sure.
So the Emtron ECU has a couple dozen analog inputs that we've used, to plug into sensors onto all the typical things people want to monitor on their motorsport engines. So we're talking about oil temperature, oil pressure,
right,
coolant temperature. We also monitor the coolant pressure mostly because we're trying to understand what it means.
Yeah.
It's not as simple as you might think. I think, as you know,
Yes.
we also monitor the fuel temperature and the fuel pressure. The fuel pressure, let me briefly touch on, is really interesting to monitor because you think about fuel pressure. You've got a regulator. On your aftermarket fuel system, you set the regulator up. You don't have to worry about it, right? That's not true. We find that fuel pressure actually fluctuates quite a bit during race conditions. That has to do with a lot of external factors. Some of it is the typical car sideways, all the fuel sloshes to one side of the fuel tank, right? Maybe you get a momentary blip of the pump not pushing full pressure. Subarus have multi-stage pumps, or where they
multi-duty cycle.
Right.
Yeah.
Subarus have fuel pump controllers that change the fuel pump output depending on your tune. And one of the things we were looking at a couple places where maybe in the tune we're actually demanding more fuel out of the pump than it's sort of programmed to output at that particular time. So there's some opportunity to learn from that. And because the ECU monitors fuel pressure at all times, it actually compensates in real time for drops in fuel pressure, or even increases if that ever happens.
This was one of the interesting things with the Cobb flex fuel system when it first came out years ago, is because they were monitoring fuel pressure as well, and it had the ability, in circumstance with the stock ECU, where if the fuel pressure would drop, it would actually compensate with duty cycle to kind of even out the fueling. But obviously the standalones could take that like one or two steps further. Yeah.
And it, there's we also have some engine safeties based on that, although we're not very aggressive with them because that requires, as you know, a lot of tuning to dial in.
Yeah. You gotta get the safeties right. Otherwise you're in limp mode and you don't want
it. Right. So fuel pressure was interesting. On the other, talking about safeties, this is one of those things where we knew we had an oil temperature problem. The oil cooler was not cooling the engine. Once it was like on our test track, you could do a lap, let it cool down, and be fine. But if you did 4 or 5 laps in a row, we were seeing oil temperatures of 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
Right, which is it's a little bit high. It's not like red flag, stop everything necessarily, but again, with the data, the interesting thing is the effect that the temperature has on everything else.
Yeah,
and you can actually see that.
That's something you'll see in a race car, though, right?
Yeah. Well, and worth mentioning here, just one step back. So your normal engine, stock ECU, you have a decent amount of sensors and a decent amount of data that's going into the ECU.
Right.
What we're talking about here is extra sensors. The easiest way to think of this initially is like these are kind of the gauges. Like if you're talking about adding gauges to your car, this is kind of a short list of the gauges that you would add to your car because you want to see what's going on.
Yeah.
this is taking that one step further, where you're taking those gauges and you're putting them into an ECU that is constantly looking at them in context with all of the other sensors that are feeding into the ECU, and logging it, so that you can go back and look at what all of these sensors are seeing at any given time, so you can actually kind of see how things relate, see if one thing could have, like an issue in one parameter could have been related to or caused an issue with another parameter, all those sorts of things. And so this is where the data logging becomes really powerful, especially with a race car. And this is what's so interesting in a rally car too, where you're driving in these really kind of unique set of circumstances, and you're collecting the data of everything that's going on in the engine as you're, wide open throttle, sliding the car around with this restrictor.
So one of the cool things about rally in general, or one of the interesting things about it, is that I'm about to pull up I pulled up right now the first stage data. So we started out in Potosi, Missouri.
Okay. 100 Acre Wood Rally.
Yeah, at the 100 Acre Wood Rally. We had a Park Firm, a Park Expose, which is kind of like a car show, right?
Yeah.
All the cars are lined up in grid. We hang out, talk to fans and stuff like that. Yeah. And then, rally cars, we leave minute intervals, right? Yeah. And then we cruise on the highway. We cruised on the highway for several minutes, just going to the beginning of the first stage. I think the first transit was something like 25 miles just of highway driving. Mm-hmm. So we're obeying all speed limits. This is public roads. We're driving through town. Yeah. So what I can actually look at, which is really interesting, is that the ECU recorded all that highway cruising. Of part throttle, 3,000 to 4,000 RPM minutes driving. And you can see the oil temps are kind of, typical. Like we're talking about steady state oil temps of around 192 degrees Fahrenheit, which is right around where the thermostat in that RCM kit is placed, I believe, right? Yeah. So, we're just driving on the highway, a lot of airflow coming into the cooler, and the cooler's doing its job. Like our oil temps are really steady. And then as soon as we get to the beginning of the rally stage, the oil temperature just becomes a straight line going up.
Right.
And this is, a function of the engine speed and the power we're demanding of it. Right. And then, we ended up basically peaking right around 250 degrees Fahrenheit.
So basically, you start running the stage, the temperature starts going up. Right towards the end of the stage, you get to the temperature spike. Yeah. And then the stage is over, and then everything is
cools right down. Yes.
Okay. Well, glad that's over.
Yeah. And engine oil pressure is to look in a healthy engine. Your oil pressure is going to be determined on two things. Three. It's determined on your oil weight.
Right.
Your RPM, and your oil temperature.
So that's because the oil weight, that's how viscous the oil is, how thick the oil is. The higher the number, the thicker the oil is going to be. And all oils thin out as they get hotter. Yeah. So that is just how liquids work, or how oil works. And then the engine RPM, well, that's how fast the pump is spinning. Mm-hmm. So which all of this makes sense, but you look at the data and everything lines up.
As oil temperature is going up in our graphs as we're proceeding through the stage, which is about, I can't remember exactly how long that stage is, but it looks like we have about 400 seconds of data of racing.
5 minutes or so.
Yeah, it's a 5-minute stage. I think the first stage is pretty short. And as oil temperature is going up, our sort of average oil pressure starts going down. And this is, in terms of, people and their Subarus, I have a couple WRXs. It's hard to get in a WRX and not just want to blast around in it. Yeah. And that's the thing is, if you're not aware of sort of where your oil temperatures are, as you're driving around town, or especially you take to the racetrack, you start beating on it there. Sure. Your oil pressures could be dipping pretty low.
Well, and almost by definition, if the oil temperatures are increasing and consistently increasing, the viscosity, the thickness of the oil has
the pressure's going down, right?
So the pressure has to go down because the oil is.
The important, that's expected. It's entirely normal for the average oil pressure to drop as your temperature increases. The question is, are you getting to a point where you're going to hurt the motor?
Yeah. are you getting to a tipping point with oil?
Right.
Is the oil thinning out and you're having a real drop in pressure?
Or honestly,
or are the temperatures getting so high that it's like, okay, this is ludicrously high.
Right. I mean, we saw, I believe our maximum oil temperature was 255 degrees over the whole race. And that's not great.
It's not terrible, but it's not great either.
It's race car numbers, really.
This is where developing your cooling system to give you like basically a controllable or a steady maximum temperature. Mm-hmm. This is the value in developing a cooling system to do that. Because if you know that, like, so for us with our Pikes Peak car, what we started noticing is that, okay, well, that ideal temperature for us is about a max of 240. So we're starting to think about, well, what can we do to try and keep the oil so that we never go above 240 degrees?
Right.
We have the oil cooler. We have all of these things in place. We just need better cooling. And is that going to come from, the different cooler placement, ducting for the cooler?
Right.
What are you going to try and do to get to the point where you have more capacity so that you can keep your oil temperatures down?
So 100 Acre Wood is a 2-day rally. Yeah. It was a total of 14 stages.
Okay.
About 140 stage miles, I believe, for the national race. Don't quote me on that, but it's pretty close to that. And then almost 250 or so transit.
Miles. Yeah.
No, it was a lot of transit. Okay. Yeah, so the racing happened in these Forest Service roads all around these towns. Yeah. So we tended to. I mean, it's a miracle how they run these rallies, considering that you had 60 cars running, a minute apart or all around this town, and them having to get the time control workers and everybody all shuttled around at the same time. We would be on our way to a stage and we'd see a 0 car pass us going back because he's flying on the highway going to the next stage to set that up. Everything's very, very it's a dance organized. Almost. Yeah, it's a dance. It really is a dance. I would love to. I mean, I would love that because they have this data because of Rally Safe. I would love to see just a live map of all the cars,
all the vehicles,
just driving around this whole area and seeing where everything is every time. Yeah, that'd be cool. Anyway, so we were monitoring. So what we do is we did 2 or 3 stages in a row, and then we would in service. The first thing I'd do is dump the data off the ECU, just to do a quick health check. Yeah. I'd pull up exactly these graphs, and in particular, I would pull up this graph. So this is a
scatter chart.
This is a scatter plot comparing our oil pressure and temperature versus engine RPM. So explain what we're looking at here. So what we're looking at here is as the oil is heating up. And you can tell because the color of these dots gets, more and more red.
Well, let's back it up just one step. So so the color of the point is the temperature of the oil.
Exactly. Yes.
And then the 2 axes of the chart are what?
So on the left side, you're seeing the engine oil pressure. So how high the dot is on the chart indicates your pressure. The color is the temperature, and then the bottom axis here is the RPM.
Okay. So this is telling us everything we could want to know about what happened with oil pressure in this sample size. Yeah,
and you see that at the bottom end, you're seeing oil pressures in the 12, 13, 14 range, and you think, oh my God, holy crap, motor's about to blow up. In that case, no, it's normal. I mean, the engine's basically at idle here.
Because that's a very low RPM.
Very low RPM, and without RPM, your oil pump isn't making a lot of flow.
Right.
And so therefore you're not going to have a lot of pressure, especially if the engine's really hot.
And there's no load on the crank.
But there's no load, right? Yeah. So, you're at idle, there's no load on the crankshaft. You actually don't need all that oil pressure there to support everything, from flying into each other. Right. If you were seeing, oil pressures of like 20 or 30 as the RPMs increase, wide open throttle, then you're in trouble because you're talking about, all those cylinder pressures are now trying to slam the crank into the bearings.
Now that's the danger zone.
That's the danger zone, right? And so we read our oil pressure off of the rear oil galley on the Subaru engine, which is right next to where the turbocharger and the crankcase breather are. Our logic there is so we read it with a sensor fitted directly to the block. Okay. It's a Bosch sensor. It's a really great sensor. It reads temperature and pressure. Mm-hmm. And we read it there because we want to see the oil after it's already passed through. It's gone up through the pump, through the filter, and then passed through the whole main tunnel, the galley that's going down the center of the block. Because our theory here is that we're going to see the oil at the point of where it's already feeding the mains.
Mm-hmm.
So, if there was a problem in one of the bearings, we started to have a lot of, one of the things that affects engine oil pressure is your bearing clearances.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've wiped out a bearing, or if you're on the verge of spinning a bearing, you're going to see an oil pressure drop, because that very tightly machined controlled space of the crank to the bearing is suddenly like just a bit bigger.
Yeah, there's less resistance.
Is less resistance there. Yeah. So what? And I'm sure that I know you guys have talked about this a lot on the podcast. But if you talk to an engine builder, it's if you're having oil pressure problems in your engine development, it's not necessarily like you're looking for really great oil pressure. It's not necessarily a function of, I need a bigger pump. It's you want to look at your main clearances.
It can be everything. I mean,
sure.
You've got to kind of consider all of these factors. Right. Bearings, bearing tolerances, the engine build tolerances, the pump itself, the relief valve pressure of the pump. There's a lot of factors that go into this.
Yeah.
And getting this kind of data, like this is where you start to see, okay, well, this is what's happening. What is going on? What are the numbers? What is the baseline? And then you're going to, from this, as you run rallies and collect this data, you're going to be able to see changes, variances.
Exactly.
That is like a red flag.
Right.
That says, hey,
so I can show you right now that every stage, as I pull them up, some of our temperatures do increase, but for the most part, they all look the same in terms of the data. Oh, yeah, I should actually.
Well, and just real quick to hit on the point here with this rainbow chart,
yes.
what this is demonstrating visually is, again, what we were talking about at the beginning, where this is the clear demonstration that as the oil temperature increases, the overall pressure decreases because the oil is thinning out. So that's what you're seeing by these different colors stacking up on top of each other.
Right. And you understand that when you're so none of this data is from a cold start. The engine's already been running.
Right.
So that means our idle pressures, if you have an oil pressure gauge on your car, you know that when you first turn it on,
you're going to have
crazy high oil pressure. And you can actually see that in this graph, that while our oil temp is below 150 degrees Fahrenheit, so this is pretty close to a cold start. Yeah. This was actually right after the park expose, so the car had been sitting in grid for an hour, so everything was pretty cool. We just turn it on and we sort of roll out of town at 15 miles an hour. So you see that our actual oil pressures are in the 80 to 100 range,
right? And
that's completely normal for a cold engine.
Yep.
But you can't expect to see 80 to 100 on a hot engine. I mean, you can even see that as we're up to the 192 range where we're cruising on the highway, our oil pressures, they come down and they sit around the 70 to 80 mark.
Yeah.
When you're under load, which is, it's great. That means it's a very healthy motor.
One of the points here that's worth making is because data collection is we're getting to this point where it's going to become more and more attainable for more people.
Mm-hmm.
What you want to do is when you first get the ability to record data, record the data, and then just compound it. What you want to do is start getting in a set of data, a bunch of different examples. Like this is where this rally is really interesting. 14 different stages. So you have 14 different sets of data that you can kind of compare and look at. And then once you get that, you're going to see what's average, what's normal.
And I would say that if I was talking about my boosted Subaru, like if I'm talking about my my stage 2 car that's making somewhere in the realm of around 350 wheel or something like that, then you're going to want to know that you can go out on the highway, you can go on a long drive or something like that, and you can see that your oil temps are not getting up to 240, 250. Right. You can see that your oil pressure when you're out cruising on the highway at 4,000 RPM is not 25 PSI.
Right.
And
it should be 60, 70, 80.
Exactly, right. And then, so I can compare, just looking at the data we collect on every rally, I can compare our transit highway cruising, and then you get in the race, and it's a lot messier, it's a lot hotter, but it's still consistent. And every single stage we run, the information looks roughly the same, the chart looks roughly the same. So we're all staying in this area. If we are, so this is why I was checking it at every service, is that I was always pulling up this exact chart and seeing, okay, where are we sitting? If I start to see a lot more red, getting up to 260, or if I see it or if I start to see this body of where we're running when we're under load, if I see this start to creep down more, that means we're losing pressure under wide open throttle, we're losing pressure in race conditions, and that tells us, okay, we need to look at the engine. Maybe it's time to do a rebuild.
No, there was I think 1 or 2 stages where you did have some kind of weird outlying low oil pressure numbers, but you were able to you were able to go in and kind of look at some of the other data points and kind of get a sense of what was likely happening.
Right.
So let's
one of the lessons we learned actually is that while the low idle RPM is great for your daily driver, it helps with fuel economy, stop and go traffic, stuff like that. Sure. It's not great in a race condition, simply because what we were finding is that here, let me find a couple places where this happens. So there would be a couple times where the driver is in a real slidey turn.
Yeah. Let me just, because we just changed the graph, let's explain now what we're looking at.
Okay, sure, yeah. So what we're looking at right now, and this is on stage 2. So I'll pull up. So this section here is the racing conditions, and you can generally tell just because.
And we've got 4 sectors. What is each sector?
So on the top left, this is engine speed. This is RPM. Okay. Then below it, you see engine oil pressure.
Okay.
And then up here, you see engine coolant temperature, which we haven't talked about much, but I think we should.
Yep.
And then we have engine oil temperature. And all of these graphs show a sort of min and max in terms of what the engine was seeing. So in this stage, we saw a max of 250 degrees Fahrenheit of oil temp, and you can see that's way here towards the end of it.
Okay.
We also saw a max coolant temp of 223 degrees. I think that's really interesting because, if you're talking about a stock car, so our car does not have these gauges in front of the driver while he's driving because there is this sort of trade-off between data and also confusion. The driver's job is to drive the car.
Yeah, you can get distracted very easily in the driver's seat.
If
you've got needles moving around or lights flashing.
Go look at a lot of old WRC in 80s, 90s cars, and the co-driver's seat, this gauge is all in front of him, but the driver's got nothing. He's got an RPM.
The driver's job is to drive. It's right in the name. Right.
So, so that's it. So what's interesting is that at these coolant temps, if this was my daily driver, if this was my WRX at home, it's not going to show me anything on the dashboard telling me that I've got a problem. It's not showing me that I'm overheating.
Now that's because the factory temperature gauge for the coolant temperature, that needle is not a 1-to-1. It gets to a normal range and then it just sits there for about a 40-degree temperature range,
which is fine.
Yeah, this is within that normal temperature.
Exactly. Yeah. 223, 224 coolant temp. That's a hot. That's a hot day. That's a hot day when you're on the highway. When you're on the highway and then you get into stop and go traffic and the engine's all warmed up.
For reference, your fans don't even turn on until 206. I think like usually 206, 210. Your thermostat is going to start opening at about 190 degrees with the stock thermostat. I want to say 185, 190, something. So like your normal temperature range for coolant, it's usually between like 206, 210, and 185, 190.
Yeah,
that's where the
exactly.
normally lives.
But your gauge isn't really going to even start moving by 224. Maybe just
like 240 is where it starts to go up again.
Maybe I think it's in the 230s because by 240 that's that first red mark.
Okay.
That's 240 is considered to be the beginning of overheating.
Yeah.
Right? Exactly. But anyway, when we're looking at it here, we're seeing 224 coolant temp. So your coolant gauge is steady.
Yeah,
but
what's interesting there is the oil temp is high.
The oil temp is high.
The oil temp is high, but normally don't have the oil temperature. But like this is, I'd say like anything over 240 is starting to get into the hot range.
Well, this is actually one of those things about oil that I honestly, this has probably killed a lot of cars for a lot of people over the years, is that oil does not like to be that hot. Depending on, you can run the best oil, but if you consistently run it at 250, you can't do a 3,000 mile oil change interval without the oil coming out just being completely toasted. Mm-hmm. Oil loses its slipperiness. It loses its lubricity as it experiences these high temperatures. It literally breaks it down. Yeah. And you can find charts on the internet. People with trucks know this. Like if you've got a diesel or you do a lot of towing, you know that you want to keep your transmission temperatures down because as the transmission oil increases in temperature, starts wearing out the inside of your transmission. Well, the engine oil is the same thing.
And what's super interesting is, so what I will tell you, my BMW has an oil temperature gauge. Mm-hmm. A lot of BMWs do.
Yeah. It's
direct injected. And like that car, I drive from here home, which is like a 12-mile drive. I drove it yesterday, not a hot day. And my oil temps were 230 degrees by the time I got home. I'm driving up in the
That's
mountains,
not unusual,
just normal. But the direct injected cars, higher oil temps are much more common. I would say much more
Well,
normal.
you have to remember our race car has a big oil cooler radiator on it that will bring the oil temps down to not 190 on the highway. But your factory Subaru has, some of them have no cooler at all, and
Right.
some of them only have a coolant
Like
exchange
the heat
cooler,
exchanger,
a heat exchanger, which means that by definition your oil temp is never going to be lower than your coolant temp.
Right.
So, if we had that kind of cooler on the car, we would never see an oil temp lower than 224,
Give or take.
right?
Yeah.
But that's fine. I mean, but the reason, the thing that I want to point out here is that if this is what your stage 2 car looks like, you're hurting your engine right now, because
I don't know that you would absolutely be causing damage at this point, but the big thing is, okay, well, those oil temperatures are higher. Anything you can do to keep those oil temperatures lower is going to certainly help improve the longevity
right.
of the car.
But when I say you're hurting your engine, what I mean is that if you're consistently hitting 240 to 250 oil temps, you need to change your oil way more frequently than you probably realize. So
Sure.
we actually, after seeing this data, so we did the first 7 stages, and then overnight we changed the oil.
Okay.
It's cheap insurance in that regard.
Yeah.
We don't, if you look at it, we put maybe 150 miles on the oil before then, but we figured we should make sure that the freshest oil is in there.
So that it's functioning properly. You're not
right.
affecting the viscosity. It's not breaking down.
Right. And just because we're measuring oil pressure at the engine block doesn't mean that we can see the oil pressure that's in the heads. And you have to remember that, the oil goes in the front of the engine, goes to the back, goes through the mains, and then it goes to your cylinder heads, which means that if you're heating up the oil enough that you're dropping pressure substantially, you might end up with not a lot of oil pressure in your cam journals in the heads.
Right.
And, these are new cylinder heads. We'd like to keep them looking nice inside.
The biggest point here that I want to make for people at home is that, again, this is where you want to measure and get a set of data built up so that you know what normal is. So if you see these numbers and you have a direct injected car and this is kind of what your oil temperatures are all the time, well,
sure.
Now you know that. If you don't have a direct injected car, if you're usually seeing, coolant temps in the 190s and oil pressure in, or oil temperatures that are never getting above like 210, 220, and then you take it to the track, well, now you can see what the difference is in the engine running conditions between normal daily driving and at the track. I mean, this is where, I can't remember what the analogy is. It's like every mile on the track is 100 miles on the street or something along this line. This is where that analogy comes from, because the temperatures, the stresses that the car is going through is much higher on track.
And 500 horsepower on the street is 300 horsepower on the track in terms of stress on everything too, right?
Okay, so with all that, now there's some odd low readings here to the oil pressure. So let's talk about that.
I pulled up this graph because it shows you something kind of interesting. So let me pull up just this segment. So you'll notice overall we're talking about engine oil temperature increasing and oil pressure decreasing. You can see it's pretty much directly correlated, right? Oh, do you want me to talk about the low spots?
Yeah.
Okay, so the very low spots, you see there's a couple big dips. So let me just look at this big one right here. So one of the things we did to the car is we added a hydro handbrake.
Okay.
To help with those really, twisty corners and the hairpins and stuff like that.
And let's just explain in a little bit more detail what that is. So this is a handbrake, hydraulic meaning, so it's a hydraulic handbrake, kind of like the normal braking system, but it's in addition or outside the normal braking system.
Right. So the car still has the stock pull, parking brake, cable actuated handbrake, but it also now has a lever next to the shifter. You grab that. Yeah. It locks up the rear wheels, because what it does is it sends brake pressure back to the rear calipers.
So it can lock up the rear axle, help the car rotate.
Right.
Very common in the rally world. You see guys driving,
drifting,
sequentials, pulling the hydraulic handbrake. But the engine is still connected to the transmission and the drivetrain, which is still connected to the rear axles. Right. And when you pull this hydraulic handbrake, well, it turns out those things are all still connected.
Right. So 100 Acre Wood had probably overall 6 or 7 hairpins, if I remember correctly. Okay. And I can see every single hairpin in the data, because those are times when the engine RPM dropped to almost 0. Because what happens is you're coming into this corner, you downshift down a second, and then you pull the handbrake. And a lot of drivers who I've just, through experience, I've realized that it's a lot of drivers don't occur to them that they need to put the clutch in almost
Right.
preemptively immediately.
Right.
Then, because as you're locking up the rear wheels, it's almost like it's almost like if you're coming up to a stoplight and you slam on the brakes without putting the clutch in,
Yeah.
the engine gets pretty close to stalling.
Right.
So, and also at the same time, the driver's cranking the wheel super hard.
Right.
So what then happens is the power steering is putting load on the engine, and our RPMs drop down pretty sharply.
Yeah.
So you can see here that we're coming into this turn. The driver then starts feathering the throttle a little bit. The RPM, starts coming back up, and then he's wide open throttle as we're pulling out of the corner, right? And then shifting, you see, second gear, third gear. It's really interesting that I can see all of those hairpin turns in the data just because I'm seeing what the engine RPM is doing. But you see at the same time, because the engine RPM dipped so low, suddenly there's a big dip in oil pressure, right?
So this is context.
Mm-hmm.
This is the perfect example for where data and context is so important.
Yeah.
Because if you had the oil pressure data, but you didn't have the engine RPM data that you could correlate, you wouldn't know that drop in pressure was at that same drop in RPM.
I am super looking forward to, and we haven't built this system yet, but a lot of drivers race with something called a Monet, right?
Yeah.
Which is almost like a GPS for racing,
mm-hmm.
for rally. And I'm very excited to plug that in to our standalone, and then suddenly the standalone will know how many miles down the stage we are.
Right.
And on my pace notes, I've marked mile markers for a lot of different things like hairpins and stuff like that. So, at a certain point, I'm looking forward to being able to look at the data and say, hey, this happened here. What was going on?
Right.
And then I can, if I need to, I can actually correlate back to our GPS data and say, okay, this makes sense why, our oil pressure was at the
This
time.
is one of those points, again, where just like context is so important.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where like the more data that you can bring in context so you can know what you're looking at. Like this is, one, it explains why you're seeing these dips in oil pressure. Yeah. Two, it's something where you can maybe have the talk with the driver, like, hey, it would be this, let me show you this. This is what's going on. This is where let's push in that clutch. If you try and get to the point where if you're pulling the handbrake, you're pushing in the clutch, so that we're not having these dips in oil pressure. Yeah. I mean, it might actually help with the engine response coming out of the corner because the engine isn't getting bogged down as much and having to get everything. So
my solution to this is actually I'm gonna set up a race mode in the ECU where we bump the idle speed to 1500 because drivers don't remember things you tell them while they're racing.
You're just focusing on driving. It's hard to remember some of all these things.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, this is the first stage. This was stage 7, and then stage 8 looks about the same in terms of temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
Coolant temp is 232. Oil temp peaks around 253. Same thing about I remember this stage. Yeah. There's a lot more of these little dips again, though they all correlate with engine RPM dips. Right. And when I look at one of these, the thing I want to see is as soon as the driver's back on the throttle, as soon as the RPM is above 800, as soon as you're then we're good to go again. The oil pressure is 50. So that's what we want to see. And then something happened. Something actually happened in the middle of stage 9. Okay. That's when we met the tree. Okay. Yeah. Okay. And you can see that had a very drastic change on the engine performance. So that would have been this range. You see the car actually, engine RPM 0. Well, the car stalled. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And we left our bumper behind. And what's crazy about that is you see the end. So the oil temps started climbing because we started the stage. And like I said, every time we start a stage, within a couple minutes, the oil temps are climbing. And then suddenly, they don't really climb very much anymore. We ended up hitting around 220 and staying right around there.
And this is wild because this is now when you're running without any front bumper.
Right, no front bumper, and that told us that we have a airflow problem. Yep. Right, because the cooler's the same. We didn't damage the cooler. We didn't damage the radiator or anything like that. We were able to keep racing.
I might even say that like this is a perfectly planned strategic crash to collect some really interesting data. Yes. Like what happens if we would just take the bumper off and just run the car with no bumper?
Oh, believe me, for the rest of the day, every time one of the other drivers was making fun of us and our ugly looking bumperless WRX, I was like, honestly, it was like we had a cooling problem and we fixed it.
Yeah. Yes. But this is what's so interesting about this. It means that something to do with the cooler placement relevant to the bumper, and basically, what is happening with that air as it comes in, it hits the bumper, goes through the bumper. How does it get from the bumper to the cooler? Well, there's an issue there, which now by removing the bumper, you removed the problem,
Right.
and now you're getting better performance in both cooling.
And it's interesting. So we see that again. This is both race miles. This is before bumper removal, and this is after bumper removal, and everything is 20 degrees, 30 degrees cooler. I mean, our engine,
PBR.
Our engine coolant. I mean, before that we were hitting 230, and after that we're hitting 285. So, well, actually 193. My bad. But everything is basically 30 degrees cooler without the front bumper, which it is wild, especially because remember on the highway cruising, our temps were all good there. Yeah. So, if you had looked at that and then said, okay, well, cruising on the highway, temps are fine. Then while we're, racing, temps are crazy. Yeah. Maybe that means we need a bigger cooler, bigger radiator. No. And honestly, if we can get the airflow right to the cooler, 220 during racing is fine.
Great.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
And then we did the rest of the race bumperless, and our max oil temps are 230.
This is super interesting because the easy assumption is you put on an oil cooler. The oil cooler's job is to cool off the oil. You're taking a radiator, you're putting it on the car somewhere, but it must be radiating, it must be working. There's a possibility if you put something on the car that is supposed to help with the cooling, that you're probably going to get maybe a little bit of a benefit for cooling, but it's very possible if you don't have the ducting and it's not getting the airflow that it needs, you're not going to be getting as much of a benefit, and possibly in a high stress track environment, you might actually be getting worse performance because you're just not getting the airflow, the cooling.
Yeah, and I know that this is something that you guys experienced as well. So one of the things, one of the consequences of us just getting the car finished and dynoed just a few days before we left for a race means that we didn't have time to put all the ducting in place and do this kind of testing with and without a bumper and stuff like that to see what was going on.
I mean, I've never heard of. I mean,
testing
it makes
without
total
a bumper
sense to test the car without a bumper. At a minimum, like this is again, we're collecting the data. You put an oil cooler on, you should see lower coolant temps. If you put a cooler on and you're not really seeing significantly lower coolant temps, okay, now you've got to look at the airflow.
And one of the
you're getting to the
we have to run a bumper. I mean, one of the rules there's a rule in the ARA rule book which basically says car can't look like crap.
Yeah.
So we have to find some way of putting a bumper on it. I mean, we don't need necessarily all the plastic and everything behind it, but from the outside, it kind of has to look like a WRX. So we have to find some way. This is our car. We have to find some way of making the airflow work through what the factory gave us in terms of the front profile.
And this is proof positive why that is so significant. And there's many ways to do this. I mean, you can add ducting, all those sorts of things. You can start to really try and guide and lock that area, and like whatever air comes in front of that cooler, ensure that air is going through the cooler, and then you're going to get better performance.
So one thing I'm actually interested to show you is I have to switch between two files to show you this. The other thing is after that crash, we did the rest of the stage at half throttle because we didn't know the extent of the damage to the car.
Sure.
And it's not that we were concerned about, the front mount or the radiator's leaking. We were mostly concerned there was a hard enough crash. We didn't know that the front suspension was completely intact.
Sure.
And and we were vindicated in that. I think I showed you a picture. We ended up, apparently we'd actually torn apart one of the front control arm bushings.
Okay.
So when we got back to service, it actually was a mad dash to get the car back together because everything up front was a little moved
torn
around.
Apart.
Yeah, exactly. And racing with a damaged control arm would have been extremely dangerous naturally. So one thing I wanted to show you is that so I switched over one of the graphs on the lower left to show the inlet air temperature sensor. So so unlike a factory Subaru, our inlet temp sensor is not on the air filter housing. Mm-hmm. It's actually in the intercooler.
Okay.
It's actually not in the intercooler, but it's right after the intercooler. It's in the piping that goes from the intercooler to the throttle body. This is the charge piping.
Yep.
And the reason we put the sensor there is because that's the most accurate reading of the air that the temperature of the air that the engine is seeing. Yeah. And this is very common on speed density tuned cars. Sure. And so what we learned by losing the bumper is that the bumper the airflow isn't actually affecting the intercooler. So our front mount, the temperatures we're seeing in our inlet out of the temperatures that we're seeing out of the intercooler are just a factor of the size of the intercooler and the amount of boost we're making.
Okay.
So, for example, we're seeing intercooler temperatures or air temps ranging from like 170 to 180 on some of the stages.
Okay.
Which I don't have a lot of basis for this because this is actually, I haven't run a front mount car personally, and I haven't monitored this. So, but I mean, you were telling me that sounds pretty typical.
Yeah, because I mean, you're always with a turbocharged car, you're pretty much always going to be having much hotter than ambient temperature inlet at the throttle body because it's been pressurized, been through the turbo and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I can tell you the intercooler is doing something because the air coming out of the turbocharger on the hot side is so hot that it melted some of the zip ties that were that were zip tying things to the charge pipe there. So it's pretty hot on that side.
Well, and what this kind of makes sense. This is again where you get in this data and you think about it in context. Well, most front mounts go right up front of the bumper. Mm-hmm. This is one of the arguments for a front mount is you're gonna occupy a lot of that open space in the bumper to maximize the cooling for that intake charge. And so this kind of makes sense. You take the bumper away, you're not really changing the amount.
Yeah, and that's the thing I could show you is that with the bumper off, the front mount temperatures were maybe 10 degrees less. 10 degrees Fahrenheit less. So it wasn't a huge difference. It wasn't the drastic shift we saw in the coolant temperature and the oil temperature. And that tells us that our front mount positioning is probably pretty good. We don't need to worry. And that if we wanted more efficiency out of it, we would need a bigger core.
Yeah. So now you know that the front mount is fine. Now you just need to look at where can you put this oil cooler to get better ducting, better airflow.
Yeah, and we actually experiment. So we had a couple ideas because, like I said, we were testing and we knew we had a problem, but there was enough other things that had to be finished and prepped for race that we didn't have time to do it. But one of the things that occurred to us is we could. So the oil cooler is positioned almost 2 inches in front of the radiator, and this is a common mistake I know that I've seen in a lot of these cooler installations. Is that basically when the car's sideways, the cooler isn't getting the air flowing directly in, and as soon as you're turning out of the airstream, it's just not going to get the airflow it needs. So it occurred to me we could place a fan directly behind it and run it in addition to the radiator fans. That's one option. And I'm sure there's I know Tasso on his car was actually planning something like that.
The thing you got to watch out with fans is what's the fan speed.
Right. And this is
because it could be up to like 30, 40 miles an hour. It's a benefit, but over 40 miles an hour could actually be a detriment because it's causing more restriction on the back.
Right, exactly. And that's one of the considerations we had is that rally stages, they can be a lot of twisties or they can be a lot of wide open throttle flat outs. Yeah. And we want a solution that'll work, both wide open throttle flat out and also in the twisties. And so what we're going to do, and this is actually in progress already, is we're going to duct the oil cooler with ducting back to the radiator and almost seal it against the radiator.
Sure.
So then we can take advantage of the existing radiator fans to pull air through. And obviously the radiator fans on a stock car are usually very efficient. Yeah. Especially at even at higher speeds, I should say. So and then because we are the way we have our standalone set up, we can independently control the fans. So we can also experiment if necessary with different speeds. Yeah. This is something we're definitely going to test with. And
and again, like this is where the data is so powerful because you now see what it is normally. You can make these changes and you can see how effective are these changes. Are you actually getting a little bit of a benefit, a lot of a benefit, no benefit, and then repeat until you get the oil temperatures and consistency that you're looking for.
Yeah, and I love the amount of flexibility and data logging that the Emtron gives us. It has, I think, 64 megabytes of onboard storage for logs. So, we log. So that's all these sensors here, and we can log a couple hours worth of data. It's set to turn on basically as soon as you start getting on the throttle. It's logging, but you can see like I have a lot of that highway time logged in the ECU. Which allowed me to see the difference between regular driving and race driving.
All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is we're getting to the end here. This weird issue you had with the power steering pump.
Yeah.
And again, this is kind of one of the benefits of having a large swath of data that you can kind of compare
Right.
and look at things. Because you guys had an interesting power steering pump issue that had
Yeah.
some kind of like weird related things that you would not necessarily think would be
Yeah.
related to a power
So
steering issue.
so I'm in this display graph. I'd like to pull up ECU voltage in particular because so on a Subaru, the crank drives the power steering pump and the alternator off the same belt.
Right.
And we were having issues with the power steering as well. We suspected it was a cooling problem as well, but we need more testing to actually be sure of that. The power steering setup is a little custom as well due to the modification of the whole front mount system. We actually had to move the power steering lines. And so therefore we had some custom lines fabricated. It's possible that there's an issue with those two. So we don't know exactly what the issue is yet, but we do know that the power steering pump was not getting lubricated enough.
It was not happy.
It was not happy. It was making a lot of noise. You know, honestly, a lot, 10-year-old Subaru, you might even hear that in the morning when it's nice and cold. Yep. And it was also cutting out. Like the driver would be, trying to move the wheel, and the power steering was coming in and out, which often means that you have air in the system.
Sure.
Or that it could also mean that your belt is slipping.
Okay.
So, what ended up happening to us is So what ended up happening to us is towards the end of one of the stages, we realized, oh crap, there's smoke coming out of the engine bay. A lot of smoke. And as we cross the finish line, slow down, get to the the time control, smoke billowing out of the engine bay. And I should note that early on in that stage, I smelled power steering fluid. While we were racing, I smelled power steering fluid, and I figured, okay, we probably have a pretty big leak if I can smell it this strongly inside the car.
Sure.
Funny fact, the driver can't smell. So this is another thing. All he has to focus on is the driving. I'm the one who has to worry about all the smells.
It's not driver/smeller. It's just driver.
Yeah, exactly. So let me see. I have to find my ECU voltage. So because the power steering pump was leaking, it very clearly was losing fluid to the point where it basically ended the race with no fluid in it.
Okay.
Which is not good.
Right.
Not good. And what I think was happening is as we were racing and the driver was yanking on the steering wheel really hard, we ended up basically just losing the belt on the power steering pump. Like it was dragging I believe the power steering pump was dragging the belt and making it slip off of the crankshaft.
Okay.
And so the alternator was also slowing down. So there were times, and it's a little hard to see this, but unless I extend it. Okay. So basically, alternator voltage should normally be correlated almost directly with engine speed.
Sure.
Because as the engine speeds up, the alternator speeds up. And the alternator has a voltage regulator in it, and with the battery, that whole system is sort of trying to provide a fairly consistent voltage. But just due to the fact that the engine RPM is jumping all over the place, and the fact that we use a very small battery for weight and convenience, that means that our voltage jumps around a bit. But there were a few times where I saw that this is a place where the engine RPM is jumping up, and the alternator keeps jumping down. And this happened a few times, and my theory is that the power steering belt, like I said, was skipping on the crankshaft, and as you're going wide open throttle, and because the pump was dragging it and causing our alternator voltage to drop. And that's something to pay attention to because the alternator obviously powers the fuel pump.
Right.
And everything else. Right. But in particular, there were some stages where this was more visible than others. We saw some fuel system pressure drops that seemed to be correlated, not always, but sometimes correlated with a drop in the alternator voltage. And so that was making me wonder if there's an issue, like there's a couple big drops that made me wonder, are we looking at like the alternator just not providing enough power to the fuel system? I wasn't quite prepared to show this today because it's very messy.
Okay.
But there were a couple specific data points that I had found that I was like,
Well, more than anything, it's so interesting. So basically, I mean, it affecting the alternator makes perfect sense because they're driven by the same belt. But the fact that you were also seeing fuel pressure drop at the same time, which does also make sense when you think about it, because okay, well now the alternator's not outputting the same voltage that it normally would. There's not enough voltage going into the system. The fuel pump doesn't have enough voltage to deliver maximum fuel pressure, and so then you're actually seeing drops in fuel pressure at the same time as you're seeing the voltage go down.
Right, and again, the ECU is able to compensate for that to a large degree. So I don't think it was causing much of a problem for us at all.
But again, here, this is the power of data and having a broad collection set, because fuel pressure, like we talked about, is something that for race cars, it's probably something you'd want to look at.
And you know what is also very interesting about that is almost at the same time as the power steering pump problem got worse, and the power steering pump itself was literally making more noise and sort of grinding itself up internally. The NOx sensor also started reading a bit higher.
Sure.
And I'm pretty sure that is caused by just
hearing
it. I mean, the NOx sensor on an engine is a microphone, basically.
Yep.
And it listens for vibrations and inside the engine. So the vibration of the power steering pump's bearing or pump surfaces grinding up it was translating throughout the engine block and making the NOx sensor pick up louder noise. I mean, I can tell you, based on the tuning, there's no chance the engine was knocking. It's very hard to create engine knock, like spark knock, from E85, and the car runs on E85. Right. So anytime the NOx sensor is picking up noise, it's being caused by something else. It's either a flat out misfire from like just poor fuel delivery, or it could be noise coming on the engine. When we put the engine in the car, I noticed that it was one of those things where the intake manifold's on, it's all ready to go in, and then I remembered, wait a second, I forgot to tighten the bolt that holds the NOx sensor.
Oh no.
And I was immediately like, well, maybe, there was part of me that was like, it's mostly in there, should be fine. But then I realized if it rattles around, that's going to make the ECU unhappy. And then, so take everything off, tighten it down, put everything back in.
Well, it's just like if you're just looking at fuel pressure and you're seeing these weird dips, you know you've got some kind of an issue going on, but it's kind of hard to know exactly what it is. But the fact that you can kind of correlate and look for any other low points, like this is again like the power of the standalone data collection with the race cars, like to look at all these other systems.
I mean, just as an aside, like everybody with an access port's used to looking at their dynamic advance multiplier and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
This here is how the ECU reads knock data basically, and I've actually spoken to some more experienced tuners who've told us that our NOx sensor calibration is probably not great. It's probably picking up a lot of noise. So we're going to go back in and we're going to adjust that. So we should actually expect to see less here. But this data, again, if this is my any car that's running this ECU, I can go and look what it thinks the engine is doing in terms of spark knock, and these are basically DAM drops. In the sense it's pulling a little bit of timing because it thought it heard knock. Again, I don't think that's spark knock. I think that's actually noise coming from other components in the engine.
We talked about that with Harvey in our podcast, talking all about knock. But there's a lot that goes into what that knock sensor reads. So
and I just had a thought. I wonder if this is true. Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of sort of anecdotal, but I can tell you that it looks, just looking at this visually, it almost looks like there's less knock noise after we replaced the power steering pump very slightly. So I don't know.
Yeah. Again, this is the power of data, but just it's so interesting to see these correlations between oil temperature, oil pressure. The fascinating thing of what happens with your oil temperatures after you lose the bumper, like it's just so much interesting things that you now understand what was going on with the car. That now gives you all these things to look at to make the car more reliable, to make the car better as it goes back together and gets
and actually just that the fact that there was such a drastic difference in engine temperatures with and without the bumper tells me that part of developing the cooling system of a car should be running with and without a bumper, just to see to try to identify.
Make sure that the coolers are working with the bumper.
Right. Well, and in particular, that helps you understand if the cooler you have is big enough for what you're trying to do.
And we've learned this lesson, but I think that this is worth hitting home again. Is like ducting is just so important.
Yeah.
Even if it's a stock car and you're adding any kind of, if you're not even adding anything, to make sure that like all of that air that's coming in through the front of the bumper is required to go through these coolers, and you've got good exit path for that air once it gets into the bay. Make sure that everything is working properly, and then especially if you're adding an external cooler of some kind, like how you duct air to it. I mean, that is just such a critical factor.
And for me, I'm just starting to work with this race car data. I am even more convinced than ever that on my cars I want to see oil temps. The 2022, 2023 WRX, the new WRXs, they have an oil temp sensor in them, and you can cycle through the dashboard, the information system to see what your oil temps are. And when I was driving one of those at High Plains, that was something I wanted to keep an eye on, because it was very much the same experience you had, where it was like in the 230s.
Yeah.
But that tells you, again, if you go to the track and you're hitting temps of 240, 250, do your oil change sooner.
Yeah, absolutely. We're wrapping it up. Mm-hmm. And I think at this point, unless, Jeremy, is there any other key points that you want to touch on before we wrap this episode up?
I want to have oil pressure and temp data on all my cars now. And I mean, I already wanted that, right? But like hell,
this shows the value.
Yeah, it does. Even like on my daily driver Outback that I tow a race car trailer with it sometimes, and I'm sure I know for a fact my temps are probably a lot higher than you're gonna normally see on that thing, right?
Yeah.
So that if I had that data, I think it would inform my oil change intervals.
Sure.
A bit better, and it would probably answer certain questions about like, oh, I changed my oil at like 3,000 miles like clockwork, and sometimes the oil comes out looking fine, and sometimes the oil comes out looking like it's been like through a war zone.
Yeah, so. I mean, it's this once you get a sense for how the data can be used, what the data means, and just like you get that window into what is going on with that system of the car, it's very hard to.
And I'd say one of the cool things about modern cars is that the 2022 and newer WRX has oil temp sensors on it, which means it's actually in the OBD data, which means you can get a data logger that plugs in either a screen if you need it, or I've seen these different devices.
Does it too.
The access port should probably be able to see it too, which means that you can record that and get a picture of what your WRX, if you have a newer WRX, what it's doing temperature-wise on your commute, on the highway, at the racetrack.
Yeah. It's just, once you get this window, it's such powerful information to make sure that the car is running reliably in the parameters that you're comfortable with, be it, for temperature, what have you.
So, I mean, I've been a Subaru guy for a long time, as you know. I'm more recently into the performance end of things, 6 years now, into the performance end of Subaru's things. And, in all my years of being a Subaru guy, before I got to the performance end of things and people modifying their cars, it didn't now I realize that a lot of Subaru people in that world just are like, oh yeah, they blow up sometimes. No. You rebuild it, you put it back together, you keep going. It's kind of a joke. And as an engineer, as a data guy, I'm like, what?
Yeah.
Why are we all okay with, why are people okay with, oh, it's time for a rebuild, it blew up?
Yeah, I mean, it's one. I think we as Subaru people, we do not do ourselves any favors sometimes, and I think there's a lot of failures that are kind of self-inflicted.
Yeah. For
really trivial things. I mean, something I'll bring it back to what we discovered with the radiator caps. Mm-hmm. If you just have the wrong radiator caps on the car, you can present like you're having head gasket issues. Long term, with just the wrong radiator caps on your car, you can cause head gasket issues.
Yeah, sure.
Are there cars that have had head gaskets replaced because they actually had a radiator cap issue? I know that it's a non-zero sum. Like there's some number of cars out there that have had that, and I kind of think that, again, like just something as simple as that is something that has happened to some degree, and it's probably precipitated some of this head gasket issue perception, because there's just this extra level of complexity down to these simple things, radiator caps.
I told you what Cameron, the driver, said to me, right? When we were talking about taking the car out to the track just to do some testing,
Okay.
right? And he said to me, "Oh, we just turned up the boost. Are you sure? Like, I don't know how much time the engine has in it." And I'm like, "No, it's from my perspective. That's the wrong attitude to have.
Yeah.
We're gonna monitor the shit out of it, and if the engine's gonna have a problem, we're gonna see it coming. We're gonna be able to do fix whatever it is we can. We have temperature problems, we fix temperature problems. If we have pressure problems or something, we fix the.
If the boost pressure is too high, you're going to see other secondary indicators that you got to turn that boost down.
Right, and but this mentality of like you're sort of like cruising around, going wide open throttle, having a blast, and then one day it's all gonna end, and you have to rebuild it. I don't like that mentality. I wanna do the thing that performance BMWs do and stuff, where like the car is ready and capable of just being a weapon constantly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean that's kind of the dream. I think it is doable. I mean,
yeah, totally.
But man, for a long time before I really took my car to the level that it is now, I mean, when it was closer to stock, I mean, I did multiple track days a year, and I never really I would check the tires, check the fluids, bring an extra quart of oil with me to the track, and just drove the thing.
Sure, but I'm saying I've been in that. I've been the guy who maintains all the cars in the little Subaru clique that I'm in, and I how many cars I'm seeing that are making 350, 400 wheel, but have no cooling system development whatsoever. No external oil cooler. No, who knows what their oil change intervals are. Sometimes they're running. It doesn't have to be a bad tuner that makes your car blow up. It could be just turning up the power.
It could be maintenance issues.
Yeah, well, honestly, I just say you turn up the power, and then you drive it like it has all that power, and then you don't increase your maintenance or increase your cooling system capacities to make up for that. And
it's relevant to this conversation. A lot of it, if you have the data, if you actually have the window into what is going on, then like, am I good to push this or am I not? Like, am I an acceptable window for temperatures, pressures, etc.?
Yeah.
Or am I not? And if you're in a good window, you should be good to go.
Yeah.
And if you're not, then you should back off, pull the car in, maybe take it home from the track, and then fix whatever the problem is, so you can be in a good, reliable window. And I mean, I think a lot of it is as simple as that. If you know that your oil temperatures, oil pressures, coolant temperatures, intake temperatures, all of these things are in a good, reliable window, you should. I mean, the car should be a ready-to-use track weapon.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. And remember, the OEMs on all them on a lot of modern cars have done all this development.
Yeah.
They've done the wide open throttle on a dyno for like an hour to see what the engine does. Like you hear about the Cannonball Run, right?
Yeah.
And how people have replicated that race.
Yeah.
We're talking about people getting into cars that are engine-wise stock. All they do is add gas tanks, and then racing an AMG Mercedes from New York City to the West Coast at average speeds of 140 miles an hour.
Right.
Just basically car at the limiter for 16 hours.
Yeah.
And it just does it. It doesn't.
It's not easy.
Not easy.
Not easy. You got to pick the right car. But
I'm saying it is possible to develop, a fun, fast car that can do that.
Yeah.
And we can do it in our grassroots setting.
Cooling and endurance and monitoring the stuff. That's the first key.
Said it to you before. That's why I like rally. It's like an endurance race.
I would also call it a car crash that occurs over about 300 miles. But I mean,
I've done endurance racing.
Yeah.
It's kind of boring.
Yeah.
Because you're just like, okay, now I'm taking turn 7 for the 90th time in a row.
Yep.
Like, and you also feel really bad because you're like, well, I did turn 7 really good, 35 times in a row, and I screwed up time number 36.
Right.
Rally is like endurance racing, except it's a lot more dynamic. So, it's a lot more
That's
fun.
true. Yeah. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for bringing this data in. Guys at home, I really hope you enjoyed this. Hopefully this is interesting, and hopefully this kind of helps give you some context for data. Like if you're starting to do data collection, or you want to do data collection, it gives you an idea of what can you gain from that? What are you looking for? How do you use this information? It's cool stuff, and it's only going to become more and more available to the rest of us. So it's exciting.
So follow Money Shift Rally on Facebook and Instagram, and you know what? Reach out to us. Send us a message if you got any questions about what we're learning here. Because I mean,
if you like this episode and you're listening to the end, put in the comments, hashtag MoneyShiftRally, and tell us what you think and what do you think another topic that we should cover is. Either with Jeremy, anybody else on the podcast, just anything else you want to hear about. Leave it in the comments below, hashtag MoneyShiftRally, so that we know you listen to the end. Cool. Well, thanks very much to you at home. Thanks for your support as always, and until next time, stay tuned to Flatirons Tuning. Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.